Good evening. It's really nice to see so many of you here on a Thursday, weekday evening, making the time to be here. My name is Akiva, and on behalf of the Brookline Peace Coalition, we'd like to thank you, the audience, and you, our speakers, being here today, joining us for the fourth educational event, which is organized by the Brookline Peace Coalition in conjunction with the Brookline Petersen-Smith. Hi, Lisa. Oh, Lisa. She's really a power behind all these activities, and she deserves an applause. The Brookline Peace Coalition is a grassroots ad hoc organization of concerned Brookline residents of all walks of life who joined together after October 7th to pass a municipal ceasefire resolution long before it gained more widespread recognition. While our ceasefire resolution was never even allowed to reach the town hall for a vote, we remain committed to the ideas set forward. Part of our efforts also focus on educational activities, broadening and deepening the discussion beyond the often flat, unidimensional discourse that prevails around us. Our first panel, which included Laila Farsakh, Omer Bartov, Abu Tokal, Tutan Greenberg, and Nina Dithmar, engaged in discussion about the past, current state, and how we can envision a peaceful future. Our second meeting focused on the ongoing man-made humanitarian crisis with Dr. Guy Shalev and Dr. Lina Qasim Hassan from Physicians for Human Rights Israel, who shared their insights. Our last meeting featured Shaul Magid and Michael Mankin, featuring their recently published books, discussing currents within American and Israeli Jewish communities. We are delighted to host today Rami Khouri and virtually Helena Cobban, who will discuss, with the moderation of Khury Peterson, their recently published book, Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. Today's event aims to deepen our understanding of a group that is, as we see this very moment today, is playing a de facto key role in what is happening in the region. The book, through interviews with leading experts whom do not necessarily share the same analysis on key points, explores the past, present, and future of Hamas, attempting to clarify to the reader what it wants, who its supporters are, and why it matters to appreciating forces that will long shape the Middle East. In his book, The End of Iraq, How American Incompetence Created a War Without an End, former Ambassador Peter Galbraith points out how ignorance prevailed among decision makers who were going to determine the fate of the region. He claims that President George W. Bush was unaware that there were two major sects of Islam, just 2 months before the president ordered troops to invade Iraq. Galbraith reports that when 3 Iraqi Americans spent time explaining to Bush that there are 2 different sects in Islam, the Shia and the Sunni, the president allegedly responded, "I thought the Iraqis were Muslims." So in the spirit of being well-informed and engaging in the world around us with responsibility and curiosity, we gather here to learn. The powers at play affect many of us in so many ways, not to mention that some of them may be operating in our name and with our funding. We should at the very least be informed. In an article published by Israeli sociologist Yair Levy this week in Haaretz paper, titled Israel's Left and Right Need to Let Go of Their Day After Scenario, he reaches many similar conclusions some of the experts in this book arrive at, but from a completely different point of view. Namely, that the illusion of destroying Hamas must be let go, regardless of how you may perceive them as a group, in order to go forward constructively. The current fragile, desperate ceasefire and hostage deal may perhaps be a small step in this direction. All too often, the concept of understanding may be conflated with agreeing and supporting, and context confabulated with justification. We wish to uphold this distinction and nuance and invite you to listen to this analysis with an open mind, allowing these perspectives to contribute to the way you shape your opinions. 15 months after the horrific massacre of October 7th, and living through 15 more months of daily war crimes inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza, with a growing number of organizations and scholars who recognize this as a genocide, we remain in deep pain as the devastation, destruction, and losses are overwhelming. In an era when talk about ethnic cleansing is being normalized in Washington, we strive to reclaim our collective humanity, embracing the basic human principle that all human beings were created equal. We all deserve life, dignity, and liberty. So about our speakers today, Rami Khouri. If you've been following the occurrences of Palestine, Israel, Lebanon region, and have not encountered Rami Khouri's analysis pop up on your screen, you've either been watching the wrong media channels or your social media algorithm is messed up. Rami is a Palestinian, Jordanian, and US citizen whose family resides in Beirut, Amman, and Naseret. In his 18 years at the American University of Beirut, he was the founding director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, an adjunct visiting professor of journalism, and between 2000 and 2003, the director of global engagement, working from New York City and Beirut. He is now a senior public policy fellow at IFI and also heads a research project at the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University of Beirut Libraries Archives to analyze the private papers of the late journalist Anthony Shadid. He has written for many leading international publications, including the Financial Times, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and he appears frequently in Al Jazeera. Khury Peterson-Smith, without an O, if you were curious, they're not related. He is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow and co-director of the New Internationalism Project at IPS. He researches U.S. empire, borders, and migration, and strategizes with activists to work against violence that the U.S. carries out and supports around the world. Khury focuses especially on U.S. militarism in the Middle East and the Pacific, and movements that resist it. He graduated from Clark University Graduate School of Geography in Massachusetts after completing his dissertation on U.S. military bases in the Pacific. He is one of the co-authors and organizers of the 2023 Black Voices for Ceasefire Statement, which was signed by over 6,000 Black activists, artists, and scholars. So without further ado, I invite Khury and Rami for this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So good to see you all here. What a great turnout. And actually, before our live program, we have a recorded video from Helena Cobban, the co-editor with Rami of this book. So we're going to go to that first and then go hear from us.
Hi everyone. I'm Helena Cobban. I'm the president of Just World Educational, which is a small educational nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C. in the traditional land of Piscataways. So I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person, but delighted that my esteemed colleague and good friend, Rami Khouri, can be with you, so that he can talk to you a little bit about a book that we put out late last year, Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. So this book grew out of a project that our organization, Just World Educational, launched last year. In May, we presented 5 weekly webinars in which we wanted to really pick the brains of some of the world's best experts on the politics and policies of the Hamas organization. And we decided to do this because the degree of demonization of Hamas has been extreme in this country and in most of the white Western world for many years now. And it was clear that not being able to think and discuss rationally about the politics and policies of this organization here in our political system and in other countries made it a lot harder to get the kind of ceasefire agreement that was necessary in order to halt the carnage, the genocide in Gaza. So in a sense, when we launched the project, I viewed it as a radical plea for effective diplomacy. And, you know, we launched it, as I said, in spring of 2024. It took until January 19th for the first meaningful ceasefire to go into operation. There was a small ceasefire in late November of 2023. It lasted 7 days, but already that was valuable. This latest ceasefire that started January 15th has 3 phases, and the first phase lasts for only 6 weeks. But to me, the crucial thing is that it was concluded between the government of Israel and the Islamic resistance movement known as Hamas. Hamas is short for Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, and they are the address in order to secure a ceasefire and hopefully a longer ceasefire agreement, and then hopefully an end to Israel's occupation of Gaza. So there's a lot of complicated intra-Palestinian politics that needs to happen between the Hamas movement and the Fatah movement, which is a movement that I have studied for more than 40 years now. I published a book about the PLO and Fatah back in 1984. Makes me feel very old. But anyway, I think that people need to understand this movement, and I think this book can help you to do so, because we actually, Rami and I, had the honor and the privilege of interviewing, having really sustained, well-studied conversations with 5 of the leading world experts on Hamas. Dr. Paula Karidi, Dr. Khalid Haroub, Dr. Yeroun Ghanem, Moayyam Rabbani, and Dr. Hazan Tamimi. So in the course of these conversations, which were kind of, they built upon each other. So I hope you can read this book, which is based on the transcripts from the conversations, and come to a much, much richer understanding of what this movement is all about, what its origins were, the relationship between its political and military wings. We also put in here a lot of supplementary material. We have a timeline, we have a sort of dramatis personae, and we have 6 appendices that we think are very helpful if you want to dive a little deeper. And we have a pretty good basic bibliography so that you can dive even deeper still. So, as I say, sorry I can't be with you, but I'm delighted that you are hosting Rami, and I hope that this helps us to spread the idea that Hamas is an organization that represents a very significant trend inside Palestinian politics, and we need to take it seriously. Thank you so much for coming, and hope I can meet you soon. Bye.
All right. Hi, my name is Khury, and I want to start actually by just acknowledging some of the context that we're having this conversation in. We know these are dark and heavy, violent times, certainly right now, but I think the past year and a half have certainly the kind of days of this genocidal violence that we've all witnessed certainly has left me transformed. I'm sure that's true for everybody in this room. None of us will be the same after this. So to even gather together at a time that feels so heavy, so isolating, this itself really feels like a victory, actually. So I'm not informing you of anything, but I just want to acknowledge, so we all know, recognize what it is we're carrying when we enter together. And kind of celebrate the fact that we are here together. And with that, I really want to say a word of gratitude for the organizers. I mean, what an honor to be part of this series, this incredibly important series. whenever I can, I extend gratitude to Brookline Peace for all that they do here. I'll just say, you know, I remember, I think my first memory of coming to Brookline was 20 years ago, 2005, which was the year of the Gaza disengagement plan. That's what the Israelis called it. You know, there were these Israeli settlements in Gaza, and Israel pulled them out, dismantled the settlements, and brought the settlers back across the border. And here in Brookline, I remember there was a rally, and it was a rally in defense of the settlers, a rally in solidarity with the settlers, and Harvard Street was lined with these orange flyers, you know, orange being the color of solidarity with the settlers. And so for better or for worse, that is my default kind of image of Brookline, actually. You know, a site of embrace of the people who most aggressively colonize Palestinian land. And what all has transpired, not only in the world, but in this town, in those 20 years, and dare I say, in the past 2 years, is profound. The fact that we can have a conversation like this, really to be felt unimaginable not too long ago. And it is by virtue of, yes, what's happened in the world, but the work of people in this town. And again, shout out to this bookstore down the street. And many of you, I won't name names, I hope you know who you are, who have stood up for the rights of Palestinians at a time when it was far less popular and more difficult than it has been. So gratitude. And I want to extend gratitude to Rami Khouri and for this really incredible book. You know, the first gratitude, I'll talk about the content of the book, but just the book itself, the fact that a book like this was written, to be curious and to have a scholarly, critical investigation of this very important organization, Hamas. You know, that kind of curiosity shouldn't require courage. And yet, in such uncritical and dehumanizing times, it does require courage. And I will admit that I came to a new understanding of this as in preparation for this conversation over the past few weeks. I've been reading this book on the train, and as you know, it was quite a choice of whoever designed the cover to, you know, look like it says, Hamas matters! And so as I've been sitting on the train, I'm like, who's noticing what I'm reading? You know, I bet there's other people in this room like me who, you know, when you go out and you wear your keffiyeh or your bracelet in public, you're kind of ready for a certain conversation. And I definitely was preparing myself for one whenever I read this book. And so, if it took a certain preparation or commitment to read the book, then certainly it took a commitment to edit and publish the book. So thank you, Rami, for that kind of courage and that work. And then there's the content of the book, which is really remarkable. And I will say, whatever question, kind of area of question you have about Hamas, remarkably, this book covers. Whether we're talking about the origins of Hamas, or how the organization works, or what are the attitudes of the organization to questions of elections and other forms of democracy, how does the organization approach women in the question of the role of women in society? All of that's in here. You know, the evolution of the organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a remarkable collection, a remarkable set of conversations that on one hand is written, I mean, it's the transcription of these conversations with these very knowledgeable and critical and thoughtful scholars. And so the tone is conversational and it's readable, and yet the content is so rich and so thorough. And I want to kind of conclude my opening with a question. Reading this book, if there's one thing that I took away, it's that Hamas as an organization is here to stay. You know, whatever the kind of fantasies that Israeli leaders talk about of destroying Hamas, eliminating Hamas, it's simply not. Well, you don't need me to tell you. I mean, let's look at what we've actually witnessed. And this book has been very clarifying as to what it is about this phase of the Palestinian struggle, that kind of, in which Hamas is rooted and kind of anchored. What is it about the nature of the organization that has allowed it to survive and be resilient in the face of the colonial violence that all Palestinians are subject to, but this organization in particular is targeted with. And Hamas remains after not only all these years, but especially for the past year and a half. So if Hamas is here to stay, I wonder, Rami, what you think that means, both for the Palestinian struggle and for our work here, in terms of advocating for the rights of Palestinians and working against the kind of colonialism that the government here supports.
Thank you, Khury. And thank you to all the people who helped put together this event. Jamila, Lisa, and Akiva for his comments, and the many others who worked behind the scenes, whose names I don't know, but thank you all, and thank you all for coming. So I start by saying to some of you, Shalom, and I say to others of you, Selamat, and to the rest of you, I say, Go Red Sox! Have a better year. So that question that Khury put to me is really pretty central to the issues I want to talk about. I don't have a lot of time, but I guess 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes max. So the basic point about this book is that it provides credible, verifiable, scholarly, first-hand knowledge. And it is not a book that advocates for Hamas or against Hamas, but tries to clarify by serious scholars and knowledgeable people who spent years, some of them, living in Gaza and Jerusalem and other places and met with Hamas people and lived among Palestinians. The single most important message that I could give you about this, and this partly answers Khury's question, is that it's not important what you or I or anybody thinks about Hamas. What's important is to acknowledge that Hamas today, regardless of what you think of them, and regardless of whether your attitude to them is based on facts or just perceptions or propaganda or indoctrination or whatever, in either direction, the thing about them that makes them important is that I believe, and I've spent my whole life, I just turned 76, and since the age of 18 or so, 17, 18 at college in upstate New York, I've been engaged with pro-Israeli people, Jewish people, Arab people, Muslims, Christians, Jews, everybody, the whole variety, and many Israelis in Israel and around the region were. So I've been involved with this conflict firsthand for almost 60 years. And I got my start in this issue of, I use the word engagement, to engage the Israelis, the pro-Israeli groups, the Americans who were involved in this. I got involved in this engaging with the other side, let's call it, when I was in college, right after the '67 war, and all of a sudden there was thousands of people on campus supporting Israel and giving money, and I was struck. I'd never seen anything like that. And I started, when they found out I was a Palestinian journalist, I was studying journalism, they started inviting me for debates and TV discussions and stuff. And so I was thrown into this at a pretty young age, and had to do a lot of quick, learning about facts of history, which at the age of 17, I wasn't fully informed about. But I learned a lot, and from that day until today, I've not stopped engaging with Israelis and Jewish Americans and Europeans and government people, every person you can think of, including the highest officials, presidents of the United States, presidents of Israel, prime ministers of Arab countries. I've been a journalist for 50, 60 years, so I've really done about as much engagement with every person as you can do. And the conclusion I draw, and I've met Hamas people, senior people, I've met Hezbollah people from my journalism days in Lebanon. My conclusion is that what's important about Hamas is not Hamas. What's important about it is that it is today the most accurate and complete reflection of the consensus among all Palestinians on what they want as Palestinian people, what they're prepared to give, what they're prepared to do, what they want from the Israelis. So Hamas is the best reflection we have, the political position of Hamas, not necessarily its actions, but its political position. And some of its actions, like what we just saw yesterday and today, this extraordinary game of chicken that Hamas and Netanyahu had on the ceasefire, which seems that the ceasefire is going to go ahead, which is a good thing, and the exchanges of prisoners and hostages. Hamas is the best reflection of all Palestinian political sentiments, including the ultimate aims of a peaceful resolution of the conflict with Zionism and Israel. And I use both those words because they're not totally the same thing. A peaceful resolution with Zionism and Israel that allows the Palestinians and the Israelis to achieve equal rights in the historic land of Palestine and Israel, and simultaneously. Those three requirements must be met for there to be a genuine and lasting and just peace. Hamas's position, which reflects the consensus among all Palestinians, captures that very well. If you read through their statements, if you listen to the interviews their leaders make, if there's all kinds of indicators, some of them you'll find in our book, some of them you'll find in other places, and they reflect not only the position of the Palestinian people and all political organizations, but they also reflect the kind of, let's call it, pragmatism that is required to move from the situation we had when Hamas was born in the late 1980s, where it refused to talk to Jews and Israelis, and it was just either them or us, fight to the finish, to the position today, after they revised their charter and made many, many statements, public statements, where they say they are prepared to coexist with the state of Israel on certain conditions, mainly within its 67 borders, self-determination for the Palestinians, a Palestinian state, and resolving the refugee problem equitably. And it says it is willing to coexist with the state of Israel as it is today, which is a majority Jewish state. About 80% of Israel is Jewish, and the other 20%, including my family in Nazareth, are not Jewish. So that's why Hamas is important. It reflects the Palestinian political consensus better than anybody else. There's nobody else in the arena that captured this. And you know where they started to do that? In Israeli jails. The prisoners document that came out of consultations among Hamas, Fatah, PFLP, Islamic Jihad, other groups, the leaders who were in jail in Israel used to meet regularly, and they debated for months and months and months and came out with a document. I can't remember the exact year, I think it was in the early 2000s, and this is available online. It's called the Prisoners Document. And it's a consensus of what all these groups agreed to. And the people who were in jail who agreed to this were leaders of these movements. Marwan Barghouti and Sinwar was there. Yahya Sinwar was, when he was alive, he was there. And so these were credible people who reached the consensus of this prisoners document. And it remains today the founding philosophical and political base of what the Palestinian people would like to have. So I want to leave that point with you from the very beginning for you to appreciate what that means. Now, some of the issues that Hamas raises in the process of engaging with the Israelis, now they engage with the Israelis in three ways. They fight them, they negotiate with them, as they're doing now, and they make public statements. There may be secret meetings, but I don't think so, because this is one thing that's important also to remember about Hamas, which I learned from my 55, 60 years of journalism and encountering them, including the top leadership I met in Amman years ago. And one of the things that I learned, and that is they repeat all the time, Hamas is qualitatively different than every other Palestinian movement that you've heard about, but especially Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Palestine Authority leadership, which is run by Fatah. And these Arafat's people, and these people played a seminal role in Palestinian history, but they really lost their credibility about 10, 15 years ago, and they're not a serious actor anymore, which is why the Israelis and the Americans want them to be involved in things. But the thing about Hamas is they will not play by the same twisted rules that previous Palestinian leaderships have played by. They won't give a concession without getting a concession. They will not recognize the state of Israel before the state of Israel recognizes the Palestinian state. That's the bottom line. And if Israel is never going to recognize a Palestinian state, then Hamas and most of the Palestinian people will never recognize formally the state of Israel. Leave apart the argument of recognize Israel as a Jewish state, just recognize the state of Israel. They won't play the game that Fatah did, Arafat did in Oslo, which is stages, gradual stages where the Palestinians, like truant delinquent children, have to prove that they are decent people and can be trusted, and therefore they can move to the next stage. They won't do that. And that's been their position all along. They want the way they phrase it, and I should repeat again that I am not a total advocate of Hamas, but I am a total appreciator of what Hamas actually stands for, rather than what it is represented as in the American-Israeli media. What Hamas stands for, and it's in its name, is resistance. Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. And they make resistance a verb rather than an adjective, that they resist. They resist culturally by sending kids to kindergartens, and they resist by giving women education. They resist by having cooking classes for men and women who want to learn how to cook. They resist by military action. They resist by supporting poor families. They resist in so many different ways, and everybody who does resistance, underprivileged people, subjugated people, whether they're African American communities or Hispanic communities or poor white communities in the United States, or any subjugated community, will usually resist at some point in political, cultural, and military ways. Hamas's position, and it comes through very clearly in our book, is that they use military resistance as a last resort, and they started using military resistance, the suicide bombings, only after Baruch Goldstein killed 27 Palestinians who were praying in the mosque in Hebron. And I think it was 2004, I can't remember the year. And that's when they started getting much more military and attacking civilians, because the Israelis were killing civilians. The government and freelance Israeli people. Like today in the West Bank, you have Israeli settlers burning villages, killing people. You have the army, the Israeli army there, but you have also individual Israeli settlers. So Hamas's position is that if this is how they're going to treat us, we're going to treat them. And they say that they adopted military tactics. They started by only attacking military targets in Israel. But when the Israelis started killing Palestinian civilians more frequently, they then started doing bus bombings and things like that. Acts that clearly would be recognized as acts of terror. When you kill civilians for a political purpose, that's terrorism. But if we're honest, we would see that terror is carried out by everybody in the region, not just Israelis and Palestinians, but also the big powers. So that's another argument. But they say that they use the military tactics as a means to achieving their political, nonviolent national goals of ending the occupation, self-determination, statehood, and ending refugeehood, and having a Palestinian state. So that's an important linkage to make. If people don't want Hamas or PFLP or Islamic Jihad or even some of the Fatah Qassam brigades if they don't want them to attack Israelis, then the Israelis should, or the Americans or the British or whoever it is, should not attack Palestinian civilians either. So this is where Hamas is different. And this is a tough position. And it separates Hamas from all the other Palestinian groups. And we saw it literally yesterday and the day before, when they announced on Monday that they're not going to return the 3 hostages on Saturday because the Israelis were not doing their part of the ceasefire bargain, letting in humanitarian aid, letting in shelter, letting people travel, and they were still killing people. It was a risk. And all kinds of pressure was put on them by the Israelis and by the United States. And Hamas stood its ground and said, look, you want us to respect you, you have to respect us. There has never been this kind of defiance from any Arab quarter that I can think of that has played a national role like this. You have many individuals, Palestinians and Arabs, and Jordanians and Saudis, Egyptians who take the same position, that we should treat them just like they treat us. They want us to behave, they have to behave, whether they means the Israelis or the Americans or the British years ago. So this kind of resolute insistence on reciprocity in behavior that Hamas not only talks about but does in action is unusual. And this is what people would call, these are uppity Arabs, that they dare to challenge the empire, the Israelis or the Americans or the Western powers. But they've done this for 100 years. If you look at the history of the Palestine-Israel Zionist, Arabist conflict, for 100 years this is going on. It used to be the British back in the 20s and 30s, and the Palestinians, Abdul Qadir Husseini and others were active in fighting against the British and then fighting against the Jewish armed groups before there was a state of Israel, and then fighting against the state of Israel. This is nothing new. The problem with it is that it has never been manifested at a national political level in Palestine. And this is again where Hamas is new, because it's the last political man standing, the last Palestinian political group that is still seriously active and taking tough positions. And this is one of the reasons why it has a lot of support. The Israelis and knuckle-headed American politicians who don't know much about the region will tell you, oh, Hamas just wants to kill Jews. They want to destroy Israel. This is just totally untrue. Those of us who know the region know it's not true. So Hamas doesn't care what people say about it in the American press. They're not going to perform. They don't want to be on Oprah. They don't care about Oprah. Fatah and others did care about Oprah. They wanted to be on TV. They wanted to be interviewed in the New York Times. Hamas is much, much more strict. This is again another important point. But I keep repeating that this strict position that Hamas has adopted, in their views, you may or may not believe them, but in their views, it is in the service of forcing the Israelis and their supporters abroad to engage Palestinians substantively and equitably to achieve a peaceful resolution of this conflict that has now entered its second century. We're just at the beginning of the second century of the conflict between Zionism and Arabism, Palestine and Israel, and these are some of the important reasons why you should know more about Hamas and then decide. If you still think they're terrorists and anti-Semites and you want to boycott them or shoot them, you're free to do that. But if you're the American government, which by the way is now negotiating with Hamas, which is fascinating, so is Israel. If the American government had taken the time to understand the Viet Cong and the Taliban and the Iraqi resistance before they went and waged wars against them, there would have been huge savings in American lives, money, and political reputation around the world. So the lesson to me is know your enemy. If you think Hamas is evil and is your enemy, you have the moral obligation to your people and your children and your nation, if you're Americans or whatever country you are, you have an obligation to know why you're fighting these people. And is military force or sanctions, are these the most effective way to achieve the goals? They used to be, in the last 40, 50 years, they were able to get Arafat and the Fatah movement and others, and Arab countries to make the concessions that Israel wanted, recognize Israel, stop terrorism, etc. Hamas won't play by those rules. And this is significant. So for me, the significance of Hamas is also in that it's not only the last political group standing in Palestine, but it is the most effective one among all the Palestinian political groups in the last 100 years. And effective doesn't mean that I share all their views and what they do, but they're the most effective in forcing the Israelis and the Americans to meet them halfway, which is, Hezbollah did this as well in Lebanon, by the way. And the only people who forced the Israelis into ceasefires repeatedly and into negotiations to exchange prisoners and other things, and to reach new understandings, were Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, in a serious negotiation. And this is something that's really, I think, significant. That it's the style, the method that Hamas uses, as well as the substance of its position. And the last point I'd make, so we have time for questions, sorry. I have many other things to say, but there's no time, but I'll write all this up in an article you can read. The last point I wanted to make is that Hamas is looking to engage with the Israelis and the Americans. From 1993 until today, they've made at least 14 documented overtures. Some of them letters to George Bush, to Yitzhak Rabin, to other people. They wrote letters, or they talked, they engaged through intermediaries with Israeli and American leaders, or they made public statements offering coexistence with the Israelis on tough terms, terms that the Israelis today would say, no way, we'd never do that. But that's what the Americans said to the Viet Cong, and that's what the Americans said to the Taliban, and then they did it in the end, because they lost. They had no choice. They were in ridiculous wars that were hurting them and costing them, and the Americans made the concessions, as the French did in Algeria, as the British did in Kenya and India. This is the story of the colonial enterprise. The last point I wanted to make, and we can talk about other stuff in the Q&A, the fascinating thing about the moment we live through is that Gaza, not Hamas, but Gaza, and the treatment of the Palestinians, and the methodology of the Israelis with enthusiastic American support during the war, has become the global moral litmus test of decency, of how you treat Gaza. Most of the West has failed this test so far. Some elements of the West have passed it. They've stood up against the Israeli attacks, which the International Court of Justice says is plausibly genocidal. Take that term or discard it, doesn't matter. What matters is that there has been a massive response globally and here in the United States, in universities, and all over the churches, all over the place. And what this tells me is that what we are witnessing here is not just a question of Gaza, Hamas, and Palestinians, and Israelis on October 7. What we're witnessing is the coming together of different forces and elements and historical memories that sees the Palestinians see themselves in the world that supports them, which is, I would say, 80% of the world supports them, sees them as fighting the last anti-colonial battle in the entire world. There are other colonial situations here and there, Kashmir and I don't know what, and Cyprus, but this is the last big one and the oldest. And the Palestinians are standing their ground, taking a terrible beating, paying a terrible human toll, but they won't leave Gaza. And this is because they understood, they've always understood, but it's more clear than ever now, that when you're faced with the power of the US and the Israeli militaries, which are two of the strongest in the world, the only thing you can do is resist. And if you die, you die. But people have never fought and won an anti-colonial battle without fighting and resisting and dying. It's better to do it without the dying and the fighting. It's better to do it peacefully. But the Israelis have never responded, the Israelis and the Americans have never responded to any of the 13 formal overtures that they've received from Hamas and other Palestinians to negotiate a permanent resolution and coexistence. So these are big sticker items. I can just give you headlines here, but this is why it's important to know, understand Hamas. So understanding it doesn't mean supporting it, but know who they are. And that's why we wrote this book, and there's a lot more that can be said about them, but I shall stop here because I'm going to get in trouble with my brother Khury. Thank you very much.
Wow. I certainly have questions, but I shall not abuse my position on this stage and instead turn it to you all. We have precious little time for questions, and the one request that Brother Rami has made is that they be real questions. And we have a microphone here, so actually the people with your hands up, if you would mind making your way to the mic to ask, that'd be great, yeah. And
I'd like to also just make one request, that we get questions from those of you who might see themselves as pro-Palestinian and those of you who might see yourselves as pro-Israeli. We should hear from both sides.
You can go ahead and make your way over. And I think what makes sense is actually to just get a set of questions and then respond to them all together at the end.
Can I go ahead?
Please, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was very insightful.
Speak closer to the mic.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very insightful. I'm Shivan Fazal. I'm a PhD student here in Boston. One thing that I missed, and I guess it's because of the time constraint, is the regional dynamic, and that was obviously a word in the title of the talk. It seems to me that before this bout of conflict, this most recent bout of conflict, most of the region were kind of on their way to basically normalize or declare peace. And then Iran being the only perhaps anomaly in that to come and to aid or kind of resist that kind of normalization. But now was the most recent round of conflict, and then we have a new administration here that for the first time seems to have put or rattled the region by what is to come later. Where do you think Hamas or the Palestinian cause could find support regionally among the Arab countries, if there is such a support? And maybe after what has happened in obviously Lebanon and now the toppling of Assad, Iran's position, so the commentary goes, is very weakened. And they also didn't come to the support of Palestine or Hamas in the moment they needed most. Where do you think that goes? This was a two-parter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and say, you can make your way to the microphone, whichever of you. You're all so patient with each other. But what you can do, go ahead and step up. The four folks who are there, those will be the four who we have time for. So just to say that right at the outset.
You're not going to answer one question at a time?
We'll just take them all together, and then we'll come back again. Thank you.
My question is just at the present
Get closer to the
time,
mic. Speak right into the mic.
I want to know, I'm curious what you think, with the Trump administration, how the power relations change among Hamas and the states and Israel.
Between Hamas and Israel.
Hamas, Israel, and the United States.
Okay.
Like what you see, how do you see the power relationship changing with the Trump administration?
Thank you.
So before I ask my question, I just sort of put my bona fides that I'm totally in favor of a two-state solution. I just came back from gathering Palestinians and Israelis together in Jerusalem last week to talk about this, because I run an organization called Science Training Encouraging Peace, of which there's a flyer outside. Anyway, my point, I would like to ask you to expand actually on what you said, because I think your introduction was really beautiful in many respects, but I also think that was colored. And I think that by celebrating Hamas as you do, I think you actually lead to a counterproductive position. That's what I want you to expand upon, if you would. And that is, I think that the Hamas military wing, which is what people see much more than the philosophical wing that you talked about, seems to have priority at the moment, at least in the news and in action. And I believe that that has undermined faith on both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, so profoundly that it'll take decades to overcome the damage that's been done. And I'd like you to expand a little bit more about that balance between Hamas, the military wing, and Hamas, the political organization, because my colleagues, Palestinians, many of them are very much against Hamas. So I'm asking for more
Many of them
information.
are what?
Against Hamas.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, no, good. I'm so overwhelmed and so nervous, I'm gonna start crying. Okay. So I have so many questions, but I'm kind of like a typical Jewish educator, very educated and yet so ignorant, and I will acknowledge that. So I wanted to know, and I'll read the book, so maybe I'll get some answers from that, but my understanding is then Hamas used to be a terrorist organization who wanted to kill all Jews, including me, and hates homosexuals and trans and yada yada. And now they're not. Is that true? The little kids are getting educated, kill the Jews in school. Is that true? Hamas is, hiding their people under, their bombs and everything underneath the schools and the churches. And that's why a lot of Palestinian siblings are being killed, partly because Hamas is doing. Like now I'm like, are these all lies? Am I just one of those Americans, Jewish people believing the propaganda? I know that's a lot, but that's kind of my question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Kind of quickly, I'm curious what you mean when you say they represent, when you say that Hamas represents the Palestinian. I think in America we would refer to it as the Palestinian street, which is a weird kind of CNN type term for regular people separate from political leadership. I can just say for myself, as a Jewish person who's often engaged in difficult conversations with other Jews about Palestine, it's actually useful for me to say that the Palestinians are not Hamas. And to say, okay, we saw the gruesome tactics or the gruesome attack of October 7th. That doesn't represent a people who are yearning for independence. And I think that I'm hearing you saying they do represent, and I think I am kind of getting a sense for what you mean by that, but I'd like to hear a little bit more. And I can also understand how these things have different valences depending on the conversation. It totally makes sense, but in terms of, to kind of refine the point, in terms of their current popularity, right? They've now existed for a few decades, right? It's clear that they're the last man standing, in my view as well. What does that mean about what regular people think about them in Palestine?
Well, all right, we have 5 minutes to answer all this. So 1 minute to answer each one. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, or invite me to eat the lunch and we'll clam chowder.
Can I take?
Any place you want.
Jamila's saying we'll give some extra time. Jamila's being generous today.
Okay. So let me take them in reverse order. I should have used the word Hamas reflects accurately the consensus among all Palestinian groups, the political national consensus. There are differences, of course, as there are if you take the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the presidency of the U.S., they represent lots of Americans, but within them there's many differences. But if you're looking at how to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, Hamas's position is a very complete and I believe accurate reflection of the Palestinian consensus that should be expressed through the PLO, but the PLO has been turned into a joke. It's not a serious organization, unfortunately. It was years ago. Years ago, it was the PLO that represented the consensus, and Hamas was out of the PLO but adhered to the consensus. Ultimately adhered to the PLO consensus that we should coexist with Israel and the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, Palestinian state. Now 22% of historic Palestine. We give 78% to the Israelis, which they already have it, but we acknowledge that it's their state, we recognize them, and they recognize us. So it reflects the Palestinian sentiment. Many people don't like Hamas for various reasons, whether it's their social conservatism. They started out as a community religious organization, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt. They have positions about women, they have positions about resistance, they have positions about Arab governments, Western governments that many people don't like. And that's normal. And the Arab world is like any country. Look at all the variety in this country. So you can't say that there is a consensus in the Arab world, but as much as there is a unifying element in most Arab societies, and this is documented now by surveys and polling. Like if you go to the Arab Center in Doha, there are polls of the whole Arab region, or the Arab Barometer. These are online. These polls of all Arab countries, they always ask the question of Arab ordinary people: who do you see as the biggest threat to your country or yourself? Almost always it's the United States and Israel are the number one threat in the eyes of ordinary men and women on the street. Occasionally some people will say Iran, but that goes up and down. But historically and continuously, Israel and the U.S. are seen as the biggest threat. So there is a consensus in the region that we need to keep pushing back and resisting. But the Arabs have been neutered. The Arab governments and the Arab people have, except for the Yemenis and the Palestinians and the Lebanese to some extent, have been neutered. They're not able or allowed to resist. And therefore, you don't get serious examples of people in the Arab countries pushing back against Israel and the West. And some Arab countries, not countries, some Arab governments that are not elected, not accountable, and not representative of their people have signed the Abraham Accords, and others are thinking about it, now less so than before. And this is human nature. People get tired, they give up. They're enticed by big contracts, they're enticed by VIP passes, they're enticed by business class tickets to Washington to go to a meeting at the White House. And this is human nature, and we're no better than any other people in the world. And many Arabs, not many, but some Arabs have pretty much given up. Many have immigrated, left the Arab world, come here, or went to Kansas, or went to London. That's perfectly normal human behavior. I have no criticism of anybody who does that. But if you look at the majority of Arab people, of whom there are now around 460 million, by the way, when the Arab-Israeli conflict started in the 30s or so, the Arab population was 60 million. Now we're 460 million. And when you add Turkey and Iran to that, you end up with a huge population of over 1 billion people, almost 1 billion people in the Middle East, in Muslim majority countries, but also non-Muslims, who are critical of Israel and the United States. The issue of Hamas is what Hamas really stands for. Have they really changed? In terms of the big issue of war or peace with Israel, they have changed. They've become more pragmatic. If you look at their original charter, which had anti-Semitic stuff and refusing stuff, we won't do anything. If you look at the PLO position from the 1960s, it was the same. Fatah Arafat, the PLO, refused to negotiate with Israel, refused to coexist with Israel, refused to make peace with Israel. Then they changed. People changed. The United States government changed its policies in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, and now it's changing its policies in Ukraine. These are normal, change is part of political leadership. It happens for various reasons, different reasons. So we shouldn't be surprised to see that somebody like Hamas also can change. I criticize Hamas for not being sufficiently clear about the nature of its changes. And there's a friend of mine who's documenting now all the Hamas statements that have been made publicly. It'll be published in a little pamphlet soon. And it's quite extraordinary to read their statements over the last 30 years. When it comes to the critical issues that the Israelis demand, will you recognize the state of Israel? The answer is, we will coexist with the state of Israel, and we may recognize it if it recognizes the state of Palestine. That's how they answer. They will not play the game, as I've said before. They won't give in to any pressure or threats or inducements. And this is what they did this week. And this, somebody should do it. If you have PhD students and if you get them working on a case study this week of these ceasefire events of the last week, it's absolutely extraordinary what happened. So this is, they have changed, but they haven't completely thrown in the towel and given everything they want, promised the Israelis and the Americans what they want in return for promises that probably will not be kept. And keep in mind, every Hamas or PLO or Arab League expression of coexistence, a willingness to coexist with Israel, including the Arab Peace Plan of 2002, which is supported by 57 Islam, Muslim majority countries. Every one of these overtures to the US and to Israel has not been responded to. The US and Israel have not responded to these overtures. The reason, I believe, and I won't get into farther, just one sentence, is that the issue is Zionism. Zionism for Jews is a wonderful thing. It's divinely inspired to help give the Jews a place where they can live in safety as Jews after what they suffered in Russia and Europe, even before the Holocaust, because it started well before the Holocaust. But Zionism, as it has been practiced in the state of Israel today, has not been supported by all Jews and has generated great antagonisms among all the Arab people, and many people around the world. So the issue, I believe, the resolution of this conflict needs to define Zionism, define it territorially, politically, and demographically. What does it mean for Zionism to exist with the Arabs? In its current form, the state of Israel, it's impossible. There'll be more resistance and militarism and rebellion from the Palestinian and Arab side. But if you look at South Africa, how the South African situation was resolved, or Northern Ireland, both sides had to make tough concessions, but they got really important things that they wanted. And that's how peace is made. Both sides have to give something to get something. The Israelis don't want to give anything. They want all of the historic land of Palestine and Israel as their sole sovereign territory. And I think we've seen this now in action 100 years or so. The military political balance between Hamas, several of the authors in the book talk about this. A lot of it is secret. This is another thing about Hamas. They've learned by experience that they have to be very secretive, otherwise they'll be infiltrated like happened with Hezbollah. One of the things about Hamas which is impressive, which again doesn't exist in many other Arab countries, the decision-making process is multi-layered, consultative, and inclusive. It includes all the different factions in Hamas and within Palestinians, and they're consulted repeatedly until they reach a consensus, and then they take a decision and everybody abides by it. The balance between the military and the political wings is not clear to the public, and that's for a good reason, because they don't want to show their hand. But what is clear is that the military acts and the political people act, and we've seen it in the last 2 years on both sides. So this military political balance is something that is dynamic, but keep in mind what I said and what they themselves say. The Hamas leaders, an interview just 10 days ago, one of their leaders gave an interview, which they don't do often, but they do when they feel it's important to clarify something. He made the clarification that they use military force to try to achieve, to get to the point where the Israelis will negotiate seriously for a non-violent, peaceful resolution. You may not believe that. It's up to you to decide if they're liars, or if the Israelis are liars, or they're all lying, or that's up to you. I'm not telling you that Hamas is perfect, but what I'm telling you is what Hamas is saying. Their record, by the way, Hezbollah and Hamas have a pretty clear record of doing what they say they're going to do, and not promising anything that they can't achieve. They've learned, and the reason they were both successful to a certain extent is they learned the lesson of other Arab governments and groups who just made promises and they couldn't keep them. The Trump power relationship with Israel, the US, and Hamas, we don't know really, still it's not clear what Trump wants. He's a man who does drama, he's a man who does disruption, and he's a man who does fantasy. And he's doing all of these all the time. He did in the last week in his Gaza plan. He comes up with ideas, so it's hard to predict anything about what's going to happen. But what is clear is that he will be the decisive force in how the Palestine-Israel relationship develops. And the first question about the regional dynamics, what the Arabs can do. The problem with the region, let's talk about the Arab region, leave Turkey and Iran out of it for the moment. The Arab region has been mired in the perpetual helplessness of colonial vassal states. The Arab governments are unable to practice real sovereignty. Any Arab government that wants to buy a weapon system, make a trade agreement, invest something big, usually has to get the green light from some foreign power. It used to be the British and the French. Now you have the Russians. Some Arabs have to get the approval of Turkey. Some have to get the approval of Iran. Some have to get the approval of Saudi Arabia, as well as the US and Israel. Israel has to approve any military sales. So what has happened in the Arab region in the last 40, 50 years is a process of de-sovereignization. Sovereign independent countries are not able to act in the sovereign best interests because they're weak, they're dependent, they're fragile, and they can only survive because other powers help them with money, with guns, with water, with food, with whatever. And this is a big problem. So what's happened across the Arab region in the last, I would say, 30, 40 years, is that the Arab publics who've not had any serious capacity to act in terms of either sharing in policy making or holding power accountable, the Arab publics have gone dormant. I mean, there was some demonstrations in the Arab world, but people realize that going out on the street demonstrating isn't going to achieve anything. And people are constantly looking for what do we do? How can we contribute? How can we pressure the Israelis? How can we convince the Americans? Whatever. Should we turn to Iran? Should we get the Chinese and the Turks more involved? There's a constant quest among Arab citizens, beyond the Palestinians, to see how they can play a constructive role, because the ordinary Arab people, have also all been degraded and dehumanized by the fact that their governments don't represent them and their interests are not taken into consideration. And by the way, the latest surveys from the UN and the World Bank and others show that about 65 to 70% of all Arab people, ordinary people, families, are living in poverty, cannot meet their basic monthly needs of food, medicine, shelter, electricity, and water. They don't have enough income to live a decent, basic life, nothing extravagant. So the Arab world has, take out the rich oil countries, the rest of the Arab world, about 85% of all of the Arab world outside the oil country are paupers. We have become a nation of paupers. We're not quite begging, but we've done the political equivalent of begging, which is go to people with money and power and say, please help me, protect me, defend me. And this is a recipe for catastrophe, because when you lose your dignity and your agency, you become disposable. And what we're witnessing, I believe, and I'll finish with this, I think, and this is a terrible thing to say, but I believe it's true, and I've been saying it for 10 years and I'm still here. We have, the Arab region, by and large, has become the first disposable region in the world. In other words, if the Arab region disappeared, most of the world would not have a problem, as long as the oil keeps flowing, which it would. The first disposable country, I believe, in the modern world was Somalia. After the Cold War ended, when the Americans and the Russians and the Soviets no longer cared about Somalia, Somalia fell apart, and it's been, ever since, a mess. And the world forgot about it. As long as the terrorists were bombed every now and then. And so they were the first disposable country. And then other countries became disposable in the Arab world. And now the whole region is one that has money, you know, for people who want to sell them cars and planes and stuff, that they're a market, but they're not a serious group of societies that are treated with respect and dignity and compassion and humanity, because they've had their humanity taken away from them by the combination of autocratic systems at home. And there was this massive uprising between 210 and 220, and none of them really achieved their goals. But the combination of being degraded by their own autocrats and being degraded by Western colonial, not just Western, but including Soviet and other colonial powers, who basically, and the Israelis, told the Arabs what they should do, how they should behave. So it's a terrible situation that we're passing through, and that's why you have the rise of this sense of resistance. The word resistance has become very important. And there are resistance movements like Hezbollah and Hamas and Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, and they took a hit now with the recent Israeli attacks. But the spirit of resistance is still there, and this is what I meant by the regional engagement. Hamas reflects the Palestinian consensus. It also reflects the spirit of resistance and the demand for human dignity and agency that permeates the entire Arab societies. and the Arab societies aren't allowed to express themselves very openly, and therefore this is not reported in the media much, and it's not appreciated. But anyway, these are complex issues in other realms, but you need to take it back to Palestine, and taking it back to Palestine means the Israeli-Hamas relationship, and hopefully, Trump, and with this, hopefully Trump will say, look, we've got to end it. He says we've got to end this war, and he can end it as long as he ends it in a manner that is ethical and legal and fair to both sides. And let's all try to work for that. It's the best thing we can do. Thank you very much.
Rami, thank you so much. As we leave, I'll first remind you all, check out the book. You know, every conversation worth having is unfinished. There's always more to say, right? The book will address a lot of the questions and thoughts that folks have. And I'll just say, you know, there will come a day when a group of peace activists inviting a Palestinian and a black person to have a conversation about Hamas is like this unremarkable, ordinary thing in front of a curious audience with curious, thoughtful questions, all held thoughtfully and civilly. There will come a day where this kind of thing is unremarkable, but at the moment we have today, and this feels remarkable. So thank you all for being part of this. And when we think about what it will take to end the world, it'll take a lot of work and it'll look a lot of ways. Well, one of those ways is looking something like this. So gratitude to all of you.
No, this needs, you need a microphone for that. No. You have to say this in the microphone.
Thank you very much. That was very good. Thank you so much.
Also, there's a bucket, a coffee can.